From offshore, Allied commanders watched Juno Beach through binoculars, expecting disaster. The sea was rough, the smoke thick, and the German guns were already firing. Canadian landing craft were heading straight into what planners believed was one of the most dangerous sectors of D-Day. Casualty estimates had been written hours earlier, and they were grim. But within minutes of the landing, something happened that quietly rewrote those expectations. Just before 8 o'clock in the morning, the first Canadian assault waves closed in on Juno Beach. Inside the landing craft, infantrymen of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division stood packed shoulder to shoulder. Their uniforms were soaked with seawater. Weapons were clutched tightly, not out of confidence, but necessity. The cold air mixed with the sharp smell of fuel, smoke, and salt. Every man knew the plan. Every man also knew how fragile that plan was once the ramps dropped. The sea was rougher than expected. Waves slammed hard against the steel hulls, throwing landing craft off alignment and delaying schedules by precious minutes. Many units were landing late. Others were being pushed east or west of their intended sectors. For Allied planners watching from offshore command ships, these were warning signs. On Omaha Beach, similar delays would soon turn into catastrophe. Ahead, through fog and drifting smoke, the Atlantic Wall came into view. German concrete bunkers rose just above the shoreline, their firing slits already alive with muzzle flashes. Machine guns swept the waterline in long, controlled bursts. Mortar rounds exploded in the surf. Artillery shells landed among the obstacles planted to tear open landing craft and men alike. The defenses were intact. The defenders were alert. This was not supposed to be easy, but it was not supposed to look this bad. From the perspective of Allied commanders observing the landings, Juno Beach was expected to be one of the most difficult objectives on D-Day. Intelligence reports had warned of strong German units, well-prepared fortifications, and limited natural cover. Unlike Utah Beach, there were no fortunate navigation errors placing troops in lightly defended areas. Unlike Golden Sword, Juno's approaches were narrower and more exposed. The estimates reflected that reality. Casualty projections for the Canadian divisions were high. In the hours before dawn, senior officers had spoken carefully about Juno. No one doubted Canadian discipline or training, but the beach itself offered little mercy. The combination of tide, obstacles, and German fire made it a killing zone. When the first ramps dropped, that assessment seemed correct. Men fell almost immediately. Some were hit before their boots touched sand. Others stumbled into deep water weighed down by equipment and were dragged under. The surf turned dark in places. German machine guns continued to fire with methodical precision. From offshore, binoculars tracked the chaos. For a brief moment, Juno appeared to be following the same grim script unfolding elsewhere along the Normandy coast. Radio traffic was fragmented. Reports came in incomplete, often contradictory. Landing craft were burning. Engineers struggled to clear obstacles under fire. Smoke obscured entire sectors of the beach. But then, something began to stand out. Despite losses, Canadian units did not stall at the waterline. Small groups pushed forward almost immediately, moving through gaps blown in the wire and obstacles. Junior officers and NCOs began reorganizing men on the move, forming ad hoc assault teams. Instead of clustering helplessly on the open sand, Canadian infantry advanced toward the seawall and dunes. This was not accidental. Canadian assault doctrine placed heavy emphasis on decentralized initiative. Platoon and section leaders were trained to adapt instantly when plans collapsed, which, on D-Day, they often did. When landing schedules failed and units mixed together, those leaders did not wait for new orders. They acted. From offshore, Allied commanders began to notice movement inland faster than anticipated. Smoke lifted just enough to reveal Canadian troops scaling seawalls, pushing through exits, and silencing individual German strongpoints one by one. Bunkers that had been firing minutes earlier fell silent. Machine gun nests were bypassed, isolated, or assaulted from unexpected angles. The Germans had prepared for a frontal assault. What they were facing instead was a rapid, aggressive penetration. By mid-morning, Canadian units had already pushed beyond the beach defenses in several sectors. This was far earlier than planners had dared to hope. While fighting was still intense and casualties continued to mount, the momentum was unmistakable. Offshore command ships adjusted their assessments in real time. Naval officers watching Juno began to realize that the Canadians were not just surviving the landing, they were breaking through. Artillery observers redirected fire inland. Supply planners recalculated landing schedules. The beach, once expected to be clogged with stalled units and wounded, was opening faster than anticipated. The contrast with Omaha Beach became impossible to ignore. Reports from the American sector spoke of pinned units, devastating losses, and uncertain progress. At Juno, the situation was brutal, but controlled. Chaotic, but advancing. Against expectations, Canadian troops were pressing forward with speed and determination. For Allied commanders, this forced a quiet but significant reassessment. The Canadian landings were proving that the Atlantic Wall, even when intact and manned, could be cracked under the right conditions. Not through overwhelming force alone, but through adaptability, leadership at the lowest levels, and relentless forward movement. What had been expected to be a slow, grinding struggle was becoming something else. By late morning, elements of the 3rd Canadian Division had advanced farther inland than almost any other Allied force on D-Day. That fact would not be fully understood until later. But from offshore, watching the lines move on maps and through smoke-filled binocular lenses, the realization had already begun. Juno Beach was not failing. It was succeeding, faster than anyone had planned. And that realization would shape how Allied command viewed the rest of the invasion, the Canadian Army's role within it, and the unfolding battle for Normandy. By the time the morning haze began to lift over Juno Beach, the German defenders were facing a situation they had not anticipated. The Atlantic Wall had been designed to stop an invasion at the shoreline. Concrete bunkers, overlapping fields of fire, and carefully positioned obstacles were meant to break assault waves before they could organize. For years, German planners had believed that if the beaches held, the invasion would fail. Everything depended on those first minutes. At Juno, those minutes had passed. German units manning the coastal defenses initially believed they were succeeding. Machine gun crews reported heavy enemy losses in the surf. Artillery batteries fired pre-registered coordinates with efficiency. From their perspective, the landing looked chaotic and costly. This was how an invasion was supposed to look when it went wrong. But reports from forward positions soon began to contradict that assumption. Small enemy groups were appearing behind the first line of defenses. Communication trenches were being entered from unexpected directions. Strongpoints that were still intact found themselves isolated as Canadian infantry moved past them instead of attacking head-on. This was not the pattern German doctrine had prepared for. The defenders had trained to repel massed assaults, not to contain fast-moving, decentralized penetration. Once Canadian units breached the seawall and dunes, the battlefield shifted from a static defense to a fluid fight, one that favored flexibility over fixed positions. From offshore, Allied commanders began receiving clearer reports. Naval fire liaison officers confirmed that several German batteries had gone silent. Engineers reported that beach exits were being cleared sooner than expected. Infantry units requested artillery support deeper inland than planned. These were not signs of a stalled landing. They were signs of momentum. The Germans, meanwhile, struggled to respond. Local commanders attempted to organize counterattacks, but the structure of the Atlantic Wall worked against them. Units were tied to their bunkers and sectors. Communication lines were disrupted by naval bombardment and airborne interference. Requests for reinforcements moved slowly up the chain of command. And above all, there was uncertainty. German officers could not determine the scale of the breakthrough. Were these isolated penetrations, or the beginning of a larger collapse? Without clear information, higher headquarters hesitated. Reserves were held back, waiting for confirmation that never arrived in time. Canadian units exploited that hesitation. Rather than pausing to consolidate the beachhead, they pushed inland in stages, clearing villages, road junctions, and strong points that anchored the coastal defense network. Tanks that had survived the landing began supporting infantry advances, firing directly into German positions at close range. From command ships offshore, this created a striking contrast. On maps, the Canadian sector showed steady forward movement. On other beaches, lines wavered or stalled. The initial assumption, that Juno would be one of the slowest sectors, was being quietly overturned. Allied commanders took note. This was not simply a matter of courage under fire. What they were witnessing was the practical effect of training philosophy. Canadian units had been drilled relentlessly in operating under broken command conditions. Junior leaders were empowered to make decisions without waiting for orders from above. On Juno Beach, that philosophy was being tested in real combat, and it was working. German defenses, designed to absorb a shock and then recover, were instead being unraveled piece by piece. Each bunker bypassed weakened the next. Each road secured opened another route inland. The defense did not collapse all at once. It eroded. By late morning, German reports grew increasingly fragmented. Some units claimed the beach was still contested. Others warned that enemy forces were already approaching secondary defensive lines. The lack of a unified picture paralyzed response efforts. Counterattacks, when launched, were piecemeal and poorly coordinated. Allied commanders observing this recognized the opportunity. Naval gunfire was shifted to interdict German movement inland. Air support missions were redirected toward road networks and assembly areas. Supplies were pushed ashore more aggressively. What had begun as cautious reinforcement turned into deliberate exploitation. The Canadian landings had changed the rhythm of the invasion in their sector. This realization carried weight beyond Juno Beach itself. If one of the most heavily defended sectors could be penetrated this quickly, it suggested that the Atlantic Wall was not the impenetrable barrier German propaganda had claimed. More importantly, it suggested that success on D-Day would depend less on perfect planning and more on adaptability under fire. From offshore, senior Allied officers adjusted their expectations not just for the day, but for the campaign ahead. The Canadians were not simply holding ground. They were setting conditions for expansion. Their progress eased pressure on neighboring beaches and threatened to outflank German positions elsewhere along the coast. By early afternoon, the question was no longer whether Juno Beach would be secured. The question was how far inland the Canadians could go before German reserves finally reacted. For German commanders, the danger was becoming clear too late. The defensive line they had trusted was no longer intact. It was being bypassed, neutralized, and rendered irrelevant by a force that refused to behave as expected. And for Allied commanders watching from offshore, one conclusion was becoming unavoidable. The Canadians had not just survived one of the most dangerous landings of D-Day. They had exposed a fundamental weakness in the enemy's entire defensive concept. And once that weakness was revealed, it could not be unseen. By early afternoon on June 6, the character of the battle at Juno Beach had fundamentally changed. What had begun as a desperate fight for survival at the shoreline was now a race inland. Canadian units were no longer measuring progress in yards, but in kilometers. Villages once marked as day-end objectives were already under assault. Roads that German planners had expected to use for counterattacks were falling into Allied hands. From offshore command ships, Allied commanders watched this transformation with growing clarity. Maps were updated repeatedly. Colored pins crept farther inland in the Canadian sector than anticipated. Radio reports, once chaotic, became more confident. Requests were no longer focused on evacuation or emergency fire support, but on coordination, artillery timings, armored movement, and resupply routes. This shift carried enormous meaning. The original fear surrounding Juno Beach had been that Canadian forces would be pinned down, requiring reinforcements that could not be spared from other sectors. Instead, the opposite was happening. The Canadian advance was beginning to relieve pressure elsewhere along the front. For Allied planners, this was a strategic turning point. German command structures, however, were still struggling to comprehend the situation. Reports reaching higher headquarters painted an incomplete picture. Some described stubborn resistance still holding portions of the coastline. Others warned of Allied units moving dangerously deep into the interior. The problem was not lack of courage or manpower, it was rigidity. German doctrine relied heavily on centralized control and pre-approved responses. Field commanders could not freely commit reserves without authorization. Yet authorization required clear information, and clear information was impossible amid disrupted communications, air attacks, and naval bombardment. The result was paralysis. Canadian units exploited this mercilessly. Infantry advanced alongside armor wherever possible, using tanks not as distant fire support but as mobile shields and bunker killers. Engineers cleared obstacles on the move. Anti-tank teams repositioned quickly to guard against the counterattacks everyone knew would eventually come. But the counterattacks did not arrive in force. Instead, scattered German elements launched limited assaults that were defeated piecemeal. Each failure further weakened cohesion. Each retreat opened new gaps. By mid-afternoon, the defensive depth behind Juno Beach was unraveling faster than German planners had believed possible. From the Allied perspective, one realization stood above all others. The invasion had passed the point of no return. This was not yet victory, far from it. Casualties remained heavy. Fighting inland would grow more complex and brutal. But the essential question of D-Day had been answered. The Allies were ashore, and they were expanding. Canadian progress played a disproportionate role in that conclusion. Their advance threatened German positions east and west of Juno, forcing enemy commanders to divert attention and resources. This reduced pressure on neighboring British sectors and complicated any attempt at a coordinated response. For Allied commanders watching the unfolding operation, this created a new sense of urgency. Plans written months earlier were no longer sufficient. Opportunities were emerging faster than anticipated. Commanders had to decide whether to push aggressively or consolidate gains. The Canadians' momentum encouraged boldness. Additional units were directed toward Juno. Supplies were prioritized. Artillery coverage was extended inland. Air support was tasked to protect advancing columns rather than just the beaches. In contrast, German decision-making lagged dangerously behind events. Senior commanders debated whether the Canadian advance represented the main Allied effort or a secondary thrust. Some believed the true blow would still come elsewhere. Others argued that reserves must be committed immediately. These disagreements consumed time the defenders did not have. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, but worse, its failure had exposed the absence of a flexible second line. German defensive plans assumed the beaches would hold long enough for reserves to arrive in strength. When that assumption collapsed, there was no effective contingency. Units moved blindly toward sounds of battle, only to be intercepted or bypassed by Allied forces already in motion. By late afternoon, Canadian troops had reached depths inland that planners had optimistically hoped for by nightfall. This fact was quietly acknowledged among Allied commanders. There was no announcement, no celebration. Only a sober understanding that the operational balance had shifted. The enemy had lost the initiative. From this moment forward, German actions would be reactive. The significance of this realization extended beyond Juno Beach. If Canadian forces could achieve this level of penetration under such conditions, it validated the broader Allied approach. It demonstrated that the combination of naval firepower, air superiority, and adaptable ground forces could overcome even the most fortified defenses. For commanders overseeing the invasion, this was confirmation that months of preparation had not been in vain. For the Canadians fighting inland, the reality was simpler. There was no pause. No sense of achievement. Only exhaustion, confusion, and the constant pressure to keep moving. Orders changed rapidly. Objectives were revised. The battlefield grew larger and more dangerous with every kilometer gained. Yet they continued forward. As night approached, the outlines of a bridgehead began to solidify. German resistance remained fierce in places, but it no longer threatened to push the Canadians back into the sea. The worst fear of Allied planners, the nightmare of a failed landing, had been averted. And much of that assurance came from what had unfolded at Juno Beach. From offshore, Allied commanders could now say with confidence what had seemed impossible just hours earlier. The invasion of Normandy had succeeded. Not because everything had gone according to plan, but because, when plans failed, the soldiers on the ground adapted faster than the enemy could respond. And in that adaptation, the Canadians had shown what modern warfare would demand from that day forward. As darkness began to fall over Normandy on June 6, the German High Command was only starting to grasp the scale of what had unfolded. For hours, information had arrived in fragments. Coastal units reported heavy fighting but gave little sense of overall collapse. Field commanders sent urgent messages requesting reinforcements, yet could not clearly explain where the main threat lay. Air attacks, naval bombardment, and sabotage communications had shattered any unified picture of the battlefield. In Berlin and at regional headquarters in France, decision-makers faced a familiar dilemma. Was this the main invasion, or merely a diversion? German planning for a potential Allied landing had always assumed deception. Years of intelligence warnings had emphasized that the enemy would attempt to draw reserves away from the true point of attack. As a result, even as beaches burned and frontline units struggled, senior commanders hesitated to act decisively. This hesitation proved fatal. The defensive system relied on rapid counterattacks by mobile reserves. Armored divisions positioned inland were meant to strike the beaches once the enemy revealed his hand. But those divisions could not move without authorization, and authorization was delayed by uncertainty at the highest levels. By the time clarity began to emerge, the situation on the ground had already changed. Canadian units pushing inland from Juno Beach had secured key road junctions and villages. Their presence disrupted German movement and severed links between defensive sectors. The coastal battle was no longer confined to the shoreline. It had become a struggle for control of Normandy's interior. German commanders now faced a problem they had not planned for. The Atlantic Wall had failed faster than anticipated, and the window for restoring it had closed. Counterattacks launched in the afternoon lacked coordination and strength. Units moved piecemeal, often encountering Canadian forces that were already dug in or advancing again. Reports from the front grew increasingly grim. Some commanders warned that the situation was slipping beyond control. Others still believed the Allies could be contained if reserves were committed immediately. These conflicting assessments further slowed response. The delay allowed Allied advantages to compound. As night fell, Canadian forces consolidated their gains while maintaining pressure. Defensive positions were established around newly captured areas. Artillery was brought forward. Supply lines were organized with efficiency that surprised even Allied planners. From offshore, Allied commanders observed a stark contrast. Where German decision-making was cautious and fragmented, Allied command became increasingly confident. The success at Juno Beach reinforced the belief that holding ground was no longer the priority, expansion was. Orders were adjusted accordingly. Additional landings were pushed through despite lingering threats. Engineers worked through the night to improve beach exits. Air patrols intensified to disrupt any late German counterattacks. The momentum gained during the day was carefully protected. For the German High Command, the night brought no relief. Messages arriving from Normandy made it clear that the situation was not stabilizing. Allied forces were not being driven back into the sea. Instead, they were entrenching themselves deeper inland. The fear that had haunted German planners since 1942 was becoming reality. The invasion was real. Yet even now, decisive action was elusive. Some senior officers continued to argue that the main Allied thrust might still come elsewhere. Others insisted that committing armored reserves prematurely could expose other sectors. This mindset, shaped by years of defensive warfare and political pressure, prevented swift adaptation. By the time orders were finally issued to move significant reserves, the conditions had changed once again. Roads were under Allied air observation. Bridges were destroyed or damaged. Canadian and British units occupied key choke points. The mobility that German armored divisions relied upon was severely reduced before they could even engage. This was the cost of delay. Canadian advances from Juno Beach played a central role in this outcome. Their depth of penetration disrupted the enemy's ability to mass forces effectively. What might have been a coordinated counterattack became a series of disjointed movements, each vulnerable to interception. From the Allied perspective, this confirmed a critical insight. The enemy's greatest weakness was not manpower or firepower, it was inflexibility. The Germans had built formidable defenses, but those defenses assumed predictable behavior from the attacker. When faced with rapid adaptation and decentralized initiative, their systems struggled to respond. This realization influenced Allied thinking immediately. Commanders now understood that sustained pressure would magnify German indecision. Every hour gained reduced the effectiveness of any future counterattack. Every kilometer advanced increased the strain on enemy logistics and command. As June 6 turned into June 7, the strategic balance in Normandy tilted further. The beachheads were no longer isolated footholds. They were becoming interconnected zones of control. Canadian forces continued to expand east and south, linking with neighboring units and tightening the Allied grip. For German commanders, the opportunity to contain the invasion had slipped away quietly, without a single dramatic collapse. It had been lost minute by minute. Looking back, the significance of Juno Beach became impossible to ignore. What Allied commanders had initially feared as a liability had become an unexpected strength. The Canadian landing did more than succeed, it accelerated the entire invasion. The Germans had waited for certainty. the Allies had acted on momentum. And in modern warfare, that difference proved decisive. In the days that followed June 6, 1944, Allied commanders began to understand what Juno Beach had truly represented. In the immediate aftermath of the landings, there had been little time for reflection. The battle for Normandy was far from over. German resistance inland stiffened. Casualties mounted. Towns and hedgerows turned into killing grounds. D-Day, despite its success, was only the beginning of a much longer and bloodier campaign. Yet even as the fighting continued, patterns began to emerge. Reports from Juno Beach stood out. Not because the Canadians had avoided losses, they had not, but because they had achieved something planners had not fully expected. They had combined speed, adaptability, and initiative in a way that reshaped the first day of the invasion. When senior Allied officers reviewed the events of D-Day, Juno forced a reassessment of several assumptions. Before the invasion, much of the planning had been built around control. Detailed timetables, precise objectives, carefully sequenced phases. The belief that success depended on everything unfolding exactly as designed. Juno Beach demonstrated the limits of that thinking. Nothing about the landing had gone perfectly. Units were delayed. Landings were scattered. Communications broke down. German defenses were stronger in places than anticipated. And yet, progress continued. The reason was not superior numbers or equipment alone. It was decision-making at the lowest levels. Canadian junior officers and non-commissioned leaders had acted without waiting for orders that could not arrive. They had reorganized mixed units, chosen new routes, bypassed strong points, and pressed forward under fire. In doing so, they had preserved momentum at a moment when hesitation could have been fatal. Allied commanders took note. In the weeks that followed, similar patterns appeared elsewhere in Normandy. Units that adapted quickly tended to survive and advance. Those that clung too rigidly to original plans suffered higher losses and slower progress. The lessons of Juno were being confirmed across the front. German commanders, too, recognized what had happened, though often too late. Post-battle assessments within the German command acknowledged that the Atlantic Wall had not failed solely because of Allied firepower. It had failed because it could not respond to fluid, decentralized attacks. Fixed defenses required time to recover. Time the defenders never regained. Juno Beach had exposed this flaw early and decisively. In retrospect, Allied commanders realized that the psychological impact of the Canadian landings extended beyond their physical gains. German uncertainty, hesitation, and delayed responses were not accidental. They were the product of a system unprepared for rapid adaptation. The Canadians had not just broken through concrete and wire. They had broken expectations. By the time the Normandy campaign ended, Canadian forces would be recognized for some of the hardest fighting of the war. The advance toward Cannes, the battles in the Bocage, and the closing of the Falaise Pocket would all demand immense sacrifice. But the foundation for that role had been laid on D-Day. At Juno Beach. For Allied commanders reflecting months later, the memory of that morning remained vivid. They remembered watching through smoke and rough seas, expecting the worst. They remembered the early casualty reports and the fear that Juno might become another disaster. And they remembered the moment when the situation shifted, quietly, almost imperceptibly. There had been no dramatic announcement. Just a growing understanding that something was going right. That understanding influenced how the Allies fought the rest of the campaign. It reinforced confidence in decentralized leadership. It encouraged aggressive exploitation of opportunities. It validated the belief that adaptability mattered as much as planning. In many ways, Juno Beach became a case study. not of flawless execution, but of resilient execution. As the war moved eastward and the Allies pushed into Germany, the lessons learned on June 6 continued to shape operational thinking. The ability to adapt under fire became a defining trait of Allied success. And yet, outside military circles, Juno Beach would often be overshadowed. Omaha's losses were more dramatic. Utah's success appeared cleaner. Gold and sword were closely tied to the liberation of key cities. Juno, by comparison, unfolded without a single iconic image that captured public imagination. Its significance lay in something less visible. A shift in understanding. What Allied commanders realized while watching Canadian troops land on D-Day was not simply that the beach could be taken. It was that the enemy's defensive system could be unbalanced, disrupted, and overcome through initiative at every level. That realization changed how the invasion was fought and how victory was ultimately achieved. On the morning of June 6, Canadian soldiers stepped into cold water under heavy fire, unaware of the broader meaning their actions would carry. They fought for survival, for their comrades, for the next stretch of ground. But from offshore, watching those small movements add up to something larger, Allied commanders saw more. They saw proof that the invasion would hold. They saw that the Atlantic Wall was not destiny. And they saw, for the first time that day, that the road to liberation, though long and costly, was now open.